takes it and is through for a touchdown for Wisconsin.
It is something that is frozen in time from another era.
The mystique of Camp Randall starts long before you get to the stadium.
It is a place comfortable and familiar.
That maybe is what people treasure the most about it. This is something that everybody kind of grew up with, is comfortable with, and loves touching again, even if it's only 6 Saturdays a year.
Enjoy the game. Thank you.
For thousands of fans, it is the center of the universe on autumn weekends in Madison.
It becomes the nexus of a family reunion every Saturday.
Programs! Get your programs here!
As players driving through the city on the bus, you see a sea of red all up and down Monroe Street, leading up to Camp Randall. You see the hot dog vendors.
Want a bite? Good.
Enjoying the drink and barbecuing. Big red, Wisconsin, all over the city, long before you get to the stadium.
Let's go Red!
Everybody likes the attitude of a Wisconsin football Saturday.
I think one of the nice things about it is it's the only time in your life where 80,000 people now, or 82,000, are pulling together, have a similar purpose in life.
Wisconsin, 34.
United at football.
Northwestern, 12.
There's something joyous about a football game.
Camp Randall Stadium, as we know it, has been bringing people together for nearly a century. So when the crews of Cullen Smith began to modify the nation's fourth oldest college football venue, they were also preserving a legacy. Walking through the stadium's tunnels is a walk through history. A history that reaches back beyond football, when the nation was being torn apart.
When you battle, team wins the war. Now, here we go. Let's go. Let's go.
Many people remember it as a Civil War camp. When the Civil War broke out, the governor at that time was Governor Alexander Randall. He was a very pro-Northern Unionist. When Lincoln called for troops, he was first in line. Needed a place to train them for the Wisconsin regiments. We had a state fair park right here in the capital city. It already had something that could serve for barracks and something to put the horses up in. And so Camp Randall became a Civil War camp for 4 years and displaced the State Fair Park.
The 50-acre fairgrounds were an annual center of activity on the western outskirts of Madison. The young city was home to about 6,000 people, a recently established university, and the state government. The Civil War made the fairgrounds a center of attention for new reasons.
So it was a very small town, and if you figure that each regiment who came through the Camp Randall was 1,000 more people, it was a major impact on the local community, much like the university does today. Wisconsin was credited with sending 91,000 men to the war, 71,000 of them trained here. This was the major training center, and it was used as a training center because the railroad, which was kind of where the tracks crossed Lake Monona now, that was the center of the rail traffic, and it was easy to move people to the theater of war.
The first troops began arriving in May of 1861. Their commanding officer immediately dubbed the grounds Camp Randall in honor of the governor. This 1865 map shows the area of the camp. It was bordered by Monroe Street, Randall Avenue, and University Avenue. On the west side, it stretched to where Breeze Terrace is today. Right from the start, the camp was a curiosity and social center for people of the Madison area. The soldiers' letters home tell the story.
Since our arrival, the people of Madison have taken a great interest in our activities. Many days they arrive to watch us drill. The women are especially generous with their homemade foods, pies, and teas. It surely is a fine alternative to the food we get in camp.
Thank you, ma'am.
It was a great spectacle. People could watch parading and so forth, and often when the regiment was through with its period of training, which was 8 to 12 weeks, the citizens of the community would make them a presentation flag, give soldiers cakes to take with them. But of course, as the war dragged on and enthusiasm began to wane, there was less of that occurred.
The novelty of the camp soon wore off for the soldiers as well.
These barracks are shanties that were used for stabling horses and cattle at the time of the fair. They have been whitewashed inside and cleaned out and fixed up for men.
How long we are to stay, nobody knows. They say we need drilling and must get more discipline before we go to the front. Well, I hope we won't stay here long.
It was a mixed blessing. It was a great stepping off point so families couldn't come down and see their sons and fathers before they went to war and stayed in Madison. Having all those many guys here training for the Civil War caused a lot of disturbances. They actually tried to take over a brewery on State Street and had to be shot away from the gates of the brewery door, so it was a mixed blessing.
The camp was blessed with another challenge in April of 1862.
One of the first Union victories in the Western Theater was a place called Island Number 10. It was in Missouri, as an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. The Confederate garrison there surrendered. The Confederate prisoners were sent via steamboat to Prairie du Chien and then on a train to Madison. There was several hundred of them who were kept here in Madison, mostly members of the 1st Alabama Infantry, and they were imprisoned. It's not fair to call it imprisoned. They were quartered here.
Once again, the people of Madison were curious.
Everyone seems to be anxious to get a peep at some rebels.
What they saw were men torn by war and sickness.
Many died here. Many of them had contracted malaria prior to being captured. Many of them are buried at the Forest Hill Cemetery. Right next to the Union rest, there's Confederate rest. Madison, Wisconsin is the furthest north Confederate cemetery in the United States.
139 of the 1,400 men brought as prisoners to Camp Randall never returned to their homes or families, and at least one of them did not die from illness. Corporal George Spears of the 1st Alabama Infantry may have been the first person hurt in an argument over a restroom at Camp Randall. Court documents from the trial that followed the incident say Spears' brother had wandered into a restricted latrine area in the prison area of Camp Randall. The guard, 17-year-old Clarence Wicks, ordered him out of the area. George Spears came to the aid of his brother. When Spears made a move toward Wicks with a stick, the young guard shot the prisoner through the heart, instantly killing him. Wicks was eventually cleared of murder charges. The incident had taken place just days after Secretary of War E.M. Stanton wrote about the prison camp.
I have visited Camp Randall. The camp is not at all adapted to the purpose, and I found things in a very unsatisfactory condition.
Security was tightened and tensions were high. But in a few short months, the war had escalated and President Lincoln called for more troops at the front. With fewer guards available at Camp Randall, the Confederates were sent to other prisons.
Company, low.
Camp Randall continued to churn out troops for the war effort. The draft implemented in 1863 brought groups of less willing trainees. The city gritted its collective teeth and endured a tense coexistence.
In place, rest.
In April of 1865, the war ended, and along with it, the people's animosity toward the camp. By fall of 1865, Camp Randall's military past was all but erased.
After the Civil War then, it went back to being a state fair park for another 30 years before the state fair actually moved to West Dallas. So ironically, the state fair park is the longest running site until football.
There were also occasional visits by traveling circuses. During the last 2 decades of the 19th century, America's pastime was also played on the Camp Randall grounds. So the area remained an occasional hotspot for the people of Madison and Wisconsin. But it was 3 decades after the war when Camp Randall's military and agricultural past would be overshadowed by an upstart American game. The action was about to heat up in the red zone. In 1889, a small group of men played the first recorded intercollegiate football games for the University of Wisconsin. The team played both of their games on the road and lost. But in their first game of 1890, their fortunes began to change. It was a home game played on the lower campus, right about where Library Mall is today. The Cardinal in White routed Whitewater Normal by a score of 106-0. To this day, it is the highest offensive output in team history. Meantime, history was also being made at the fairgrounds to the west.
In the 1890s, State Fair left for West Dallas, and it got taken over by the Dane County Fair. The Dane County Agricultural Society decided it would be a great idea to sell this plot then for a subdivision. Fortunately, the Civil War veterans were still very much in force. It was only 30 years after the war. And so they got their General Lucius Fairchild all steamed up, headed down to the legislature and said, "Gentlemen, you need to save this land. It needs to be known in perpetuity for the training ground of the Civil War veterans."
Gentlemen, there is property. The university needs it. The price is cheap. If you don't buy it, I will.
The legislature at that time took his word for it. There was a lot of pressure. So they bought this entire plot of land for less than $20,000. Gave it to the university. And that's when the university athletic history started in the 1890s.
In 1893, the fields that had at one time helped prepare young men for war became a battleground for athletic competition. At first, just track and field events were held here. But as UW football and baseball gained popularity, the sports needed a new home. The newly acquired fairground land was perfect.
Actually where the engineering campus is today. And they turned around the State Fair Park horse racing grandstand, and that became the football grandstand.
A veterans group petitioned the Regents to preserve the area's name as Camp Randall. Their request was granted, and the stadium's military legacy was secured. Securing a seat at that first Camp Randall Stadium was not so easy.
And on really big games, they brought in temporary bleachers from Baraboo that were the bleachers from the Ringling Brothers Barnum Bailey Circus. They brought it down on the train and set it up for big games like Minnesota and Chicago.
In fact, one of the biggest games played at that stadium was a 6-0 win against arch-rival Minnesota in 1896.
About noon, thousands of spectators began to converge on Camp Randall, most on foot, some riding streetcars, and a few riding in magnificent carriages. From the time the game began until it was over, the crowd grew noisier and noisier. When Wisconsin won 6-0, everybody went crazy.
That reaction would repeat itself many times in the future. The team's winning habits at home helped contribute to this love affair with UW football. Between 1895 and 1905, Wisconsin recorded 59 wins and just 4 defeats in the first Camp Randall. The coach for most of that decade was Phil King, a Princeton graduate who at one point had a 17-game winning streak. Two players who contributed to the success of those late 19th century squads were John C. Icky Carroll and Pat O'Day, the kangaroo kicker. Carroll was small by today's standards, 5 foot 10 inches and about 160 pounds. But the halfback was the workhorse of the first team to play at the corner of Randall and University. He was the perfect complement to the golden leg of Pat O'Day.
My favorite is the kangaroo kicker at the turn of the century from Australia, who came over and was a sensation as a punter at the turn of the century, punting regularly 60, 70 yards, setting the all-time record of 90-plus yards for a punt.
O'Day was actually credited with kicking a punt 110 yards, the length of the field at the turn of the century.
After he graduated, he went invisible.
But along with names like Jerry Reardon, Art Curtis, and John Richards, O'Day and Carroll helped make sure plenty of people heard about Wisconsin football. In 1896 and 97, UW gathered 2 titles in what was then known as the Western Conference. In 1901, the team had its first undefeated season. One of the players to carry the ball during that season was halfback Eddie Kokums. Eddie's brother, Henry, had also played for the Badgers. Henry used his tackling technique to wrestle down the man who shot Teddy Roosevelt in Milwaukee. The former president was on his way to make a speech in 1912. Roosevelt took a bullet, but gave the speech anyway, and lived to tell about it. By that time, Eddie Kokums had gone on to coach at St. Louis University. Later, legendary Notre Dame football coach Newt Rockne credited him for being the first college coach to take full advantage of a passing game in 1906. The forward pass was just one change in the game to come out of major reforms. Complaints about brutality and graft led university leaders like Wisconsin's Charles Van Hise to support playing fewer games in the season. 2 of the games cut from the schedule were against traditional rivals Minnesota and Chicago. 1906 was the only year since 1890 that the Badgers did not play the Gophers in the traditional border battle. Fewer games would eventually lead to less revenue and financial difficulty. Still, the first stadium had become a major venue for leisure time activity.
This was a major civic site in town.
The grounds were also still a memorial park to the area's wartime roots.
As time went on, the university began to grow. The university was beginning to gobble up areas of this Camp Randall for athletic purposes. The veterans of the Civil War, who were older gentlemen at the time, wanted to have the place remembered as a place of the Civil War association. They pressured the state for the arch.
The soldiers gathered to dedicate the memorial in June of 1912.
The veterans said that we're proud of the modern-day university, but we want you to know that this was our campus, too. We're proud of the role we played, and this was our campus, and we'd like to save a portion of it to be remembered by. Looking back, you'd have to say, here's this green space in the midst of what has become an intensely developed area.
Just as they had during the war between the states, the old soldiers once again wrote about their experiences at Camp Randall.
Boys and girls came off the streets. Automobiles brought load after load of people from uptown until the hill looked much as it did on a pleasant afternoon when folks used to come out from the city to see us on dress parade.
The spirit I feel here is the kind of solemnity of the space. It is a memorial, and it does have a kind of a memorial quality. It is able, I think, to communicate a kind of a reflective mood. Look at the people when they walk through here. Very calm. I think it has a very nice feeling. I like the arch, too. I think the arch is very appealing as well.
There are other reminders of Camp Randall's roots here, but the 20th century promised many more memories in the Red Zone. The athletic reforms of 1905 made it more difficult for the football program to support athletics at UW. Fewer games meant less money, but not fewer wins for the football team. In 1906, the Badgers turned in a perfect 5-0 record. The team gave up only 4 points at Camp Randall. It was during that first decade of the 20th century that Camp Randall also became home to its first musical hit. William T. Purdy and Carl Beck actually wrote the song for a University of Minnesota fight song contest. But Beck, a former UW student, convinced Purdy to submit the song to Wisconsin.
I've talked with Bill Purdy's daughter, and she said that story Bill Purdy told many times, so it must have been accurate.
Beck wrote the lyrics. Like Camp Randall itself, the famous title of the song also had roots in the Civil War. It was a young lieutenant from the 24th Wisconsin Infantry who first coined the phrase, "on Wisconsin."
This is Arthur MacArthur.
The 19-year-old soldier from Milwaukee lifted the Union colors at a pivotal moment in the Battle of Missionary Ridge.
He grabbed the flag on Wisconsin. The men rushed forward, as did many other units, sort of spur of the moment kind of thing, and they took the hill.
His own heroics aside, Arthur MacArthur may be better known as the father of 20th century American hero, General Douglas MacArthur. "On Wisconsin" is now better known as one of the most recognizable fight songs in the world.
And it was introduced at homecoming in 1909, and it was a huge hit immediately, and it became our song.
The Badgers may have gotten the fight song, but the Gophers got the win in that homecoming game, walloping Wisconsin 34-6. Around the same time, university leaders recognized the old stadium at the corner of Randall and University was not large enough or safe enough for fans. Planning for a new stadium began in 1908. State architect Arthur Peabody's original plan actually had the stadium being built along the shores of Lake Mendota. The Regents petitioned state lawmakers for $40,000 in funding, but they were not ready to pay for the stadium in Peabody's plan. In the meantime, the Badgers continued to be a crowd pleaser. Quarterback Keke Mall led UW to 2 winning seasons in 3 years. Then in 1912, Badger legend Bill Juneau returned to coach his alma mater. Juneau had been a star end for Wisconsin at the turn of the century. Juneau's team racked up 246 points behind the strong play of quarterback Eddie Gillette and halfback John Van Riper. His defense, led by colorful linemen like Wisconsin's first All-American Robert Butts Butler and Ray Tubby Keeler, gave up only 29 points on their way to 7 straight wins and no losses. It was the Badgers' 3rd undefeated season and its 5th Big Ten championship. Following one game, the drunken jubilation on campus was a little too much for one Madison newspaper to stomach.
If there is no healthier and no happier way to honor and to love our college than by distressing our stomachs, souring our breaths, and befogging our brains, let us get something that is better than football, something that will inspire the happy and wholesome aspirations of manhood.
Perhaps the partiers knew something the editorialist didn't. It would be 40 years before the Badger faithful would celebrate another league champion from the Camp Randall gridiron. They did have some colorful players to watch. One of them, an All-American tackle, Howard Cub Buck, was on the field in 1915. That's when the bleachers on the north side of the stadium collapsed.
When we had a big game against Minnesota, we had all the temporary bleachers from the circus. In the middle of the second quarter, 3 of the bleachers collapsed. They were literally just stuck in the mud, had no railings. It was very dangerous, and by today's standards.
Legendary sports writer Ring Lardner was at the game and wrote about the collapse.
There was about 1,000 or maybe 5,000 people in one of the cheering stands, and all of a sudden it caved in somewhere, and all the people was thrown on the ground. Some of them was hurt pretty bad, too.
About 1,800 people were on the 3 100-foot sections that collapsed. Amazingly, there were only minor injuries. 15 minutes after the collapse, the Badgers and Gophers were back in action on the field. Minnesota ended up winning 20-3. University officials went on to push for a new stadium after the collapse.
We have been for years urging a concrete stadium at Camp Randall, but it was just cut out of the bill offered on the floor of the Senate. Today's accident shows how imperative is the need.
The hill along what is now Breeze Terrace at one time had held barracks for Union troops in training. As the new Camp Randall Stadium was being built, a new war, the Great War, would play a part in its immediate future. Though the United States had not yet entered World War I, a shortage of war-related materials slowed the progress of construction on the new stadium. Work began in 1915, but these doughboys training in Madison's Arboretum were already headed for the European trenches by the time the stadium was finished.
So they built about 30 rows of concrete bleachers into the hill on the west side of Breeze Terrace and moved the field over here in 1917. And of course, we've been here ever since. And ironically, the concrete they poured in 1917 is still there.
With many young men leaving for war, former Badger John Richards returned to Wisconsin. Richards had played alongside Pat O'Day in the mid-1890s and immediately christened the new Camp Randall with a win. The first game played on the new field was October 6, 1917 against Beloit, a 34-0 Wisconsin win.
And then that started a whole long series of piecemeal expansions. This is a frugal state with frugal people. Instead of building new stadiums, they would say, okay, how can we add a piece on here and there? So if you pan around and look at the stadium today, it started out here on the west side with just some bleachers, and they moved the old grandstands from the State Fair Park on the east side.
Those stands were in place when the stadium was officially dedicated later in the 1917 season on November 3rd. It was the homecoming game against Minnesota. The Badgers won 10-7 in front of a crowd of 10,000 people. With the nation in the throes of a world war, the university and Camp Randall once again had a role. 7 barracks were built on the old Civil War tenting grounds. The 1,000 men living there were part of the Student Army Training Corps. The war ended before they were called to combat. Before Coach Richards' final season in 1922, the one section of the stadium that served as a link back to his playing days was also gone. A student living on Breeze Terrace reported seeing flames at Camp Randall in June of 1922. The old wood grandstand moved over from the fairgrounds was on fire. One day after they had been sold for salvage, the grandstands were a total loss. To this day, the cause remains a mystery. Even before the stadium was built at its present location, the university was making adjustments to the plans. Arthur Peabody's office was drawing up blueprints for seating. But limited funds meant the university would have to build its stadium as the money became available.
This is 1916, which is the year before Camp Randall was opened.
When it comes to digging into the mysteries and history of Camp Randall, David Vitale is one of the best.
You can see the Capitol Rotunda in the 1930s.
Vitale grew up just down the street from the stadium, and his fascination with everything Badger fills one half of his basement.
If you look at the artifacts here, they really tell a story of the chronology of the 20th century, for example, between the field house and what would be Section.
Vitale has also spoken with some of the people who remember when Camp Randall was new. Bob Poser played baseball and basketball at Wisconsin in the late 20s. Later, he went on to become head baseball coach. Vitale recorded this interview with him in 2000.
My dad took me to a game or two.
Poser's first memory of Camp Randall goes back to 1920, when the stadium was just 3 years old.
The first game I saw was against Lawrence College. And I remember the score, we beat them 60-0.
60-0.
And my favorite player was Guy Suntz, who was later track coach and athletic director.
Sunt played fullback for the Badgers and was one of Coach Richard's captains.
He taught me how to punt.
Sunt played on successful teams that helped build demand for more seats at Camp Randall. After the grandstand fire of '22, construction began on concrete bleachers for the east side of the stadium.
Like anything, new facilities happen a lot easier when there's a crisis. That happened then, and in fact it was one of the lessons that we had throughout.
By 1924, the state had spent nearly $100,000 on building the stadium. The east side stands were underway, and the temporary bleachers on the north side were replaced with concrete seating.
30,000 was a big crowd. It was a sellout.
That's just about how many people were on hand when Newt Rockne made his first appearance at Camp Randall as coach of Notre Dame's Fighting Irish.
I think it was 1924. I saw Notre Dame play, the Four Horsemen. So Dad wanted me to be sure to see them play.
One of them went on to coach at Wisconsin, didn't he? Stuhlberger?
Harry Stuhlberger. Yeah. Became athletic director and coach. In that game, we were ahead 3-0 by a drop kick by Doyle Harmon. I thought, gee, we're going to beat Notre Dame. That'll be something. The shock troops started, the second string. And then he put in the real first string, and they beat us 38-3.
The loss to Notre Dame was one of 3 in Jack Ryan's last season as head coach at Wisconsin. Notre Dame was not on the schedule in 1925 when George Little took over as coach and athletic director. Little's teams were successful during his 2 years as coach. His excellent staff of assistants included a young man named Earl Red Blake. Blake later went on to coach Army at West Point, where he hired another Wisconsin football legend, Vince Lombardi. The next time Notre Dame arrived to play at Camp Randall, Glenn Thistlethwaite was in his second season as head coach of Wisconsin. Many people took to calling him Gloomy Glenn. His team is shown playing in this rare film from 1928. It was not a year that would make a coach gloomy.
The first game we played was against Newt Rockne.
Sam Baer was a young quarterback from Rockford making his first varsity start.
Oh yes, the stadium was packed. Our team was almost all sophomores when I started to play. That's when Thistlethwaite said that you're playing against the best coach and the best team, and you go out and have a good time. I don't expect you to win. And we did pretty well. We beat them.
The 22-6 shellacking did not sit well with Rockne, who forever called the game the victory in tall grass. Bill Aspinwall, who later became assistant athletic director, was the head usher at the time. In an interview with the UW Oral History Project, Aspinwall tells how Rockne reacted to Camp Randall's long grass.
So when Rockne brought his team on Friday afternoon, he walked onto the field and he looked at the grass and he said, "What's Glenn going to do, hide his boys out there tomorrow?"
Thistlethwaite refused Rockne's request to cut the grass before the game. Bear threw the first Badger touchdown in the game and went on to throw more that year. His pass to Bo Cuisenaire beat Michigan for the first time since 1899. Bear and his teammates prided themselves on toughness.
Being injured didn't stop him. My freshman year, of course, I dislocated my knee. My own fraternity brother was the guy that landed on me when I was getting up from the ground. He landed me in this leg going off at a right angle. So I was in the hospital for 4 weeks my freshman year.
His sophomore year, Bear was playing for the Big Ten championship in the final game of the season at Camp Randall. The opponent was Minnesota and their hard-hitting fullback, Bronco Nagurski. He was too much for the young Badgers, scoring the game's only touchdown in a 6-0 Gopher win. It was as close as Bear and his Badger teammates would get to the championship.
It was a good 3 years of football, and I played every game, hurt or not.
Bear's friend, Bobby Poser, was having a few good years of his own on the baseball field. By the 30s, the ball diamond was situated between the stadium and University Avenue. Poser played alongside Bill Shorer, who would soon marry his Sauk City sweetheart, Lavona. Voni to most people.
Get him!
Voni went to her first game with Bill in 1932. More than 70 years later, she has seen nearly 400 games from her seats in Section D.
I've only missed one game since '34. Oh, I was in bed with the flu, but my husband went. I wouldn't miss a game, regardless of the weather, rain or shine or snow. O'er the ramparts we watch, were so gallantly streaming, and the
When Shorer first started braving the elements, the field house had just been built. The band had just started spelling out words on the field, and the crowd was a bit more formal.
Heavens, we used to be all dressed up to come to games. Fur coats and fancy blankets and what have you to keep warm.
The Badger pleasing the crowd back in '32 was Mickey McGuire.
I was about 8 years old when Mickey McGuire played at Wisconsin.
Tom Butler would grow up to write about the Badgers as a sports journalist. But as Voni Shorer was cheering McGuire on, Butler and his buddies on Madison's East Side were dreaming of gridiron glory.
When we were kids and we played sandlot football, we all wanted to be Mickey McGuire, not Red Grange or anybody. In '32, they beat Minnesota about 20-13, and he scored all 3 touchdowns. And he was all Big Ten. I got to know him years later. He used to come back here every once in a while to commemorate that Minnesota game.
McGuire's last year at UW was the first for new head coach Clarence Spears. Glenn Thistlethwaite's poor record against conference opponents made him a target of angry alumni. At the same time, Thistlethwaite's biggest supporter, athletic director George Little, was under fire for a $72,000 department deficit. Some had even taken to calling the $500,000 construction of the field house Little's folly. Under pressure, both Little and Gloomy Glenn resigned. Former Badger All-American Arlie Mux championed the hiring of Spears, the former Minnesota coach who had turned out some powerful teams in the 20s. Spears' winning season in 1932 proved to be a bit of a Camp Randall mirage. Perhaps it was fate that the man known as Gloomy Glenn would meet his demise during the Great Depression. During the 1930s, more Americans were lining up for soup, but the lines for tickets at stadiums like Camp Randall were dwindling. In 1931, Thistlethwaite's last year as head coach, average attendance at home games had dropped to just over 15,000. That was nearly half of the 29,000 who watched when Bear and his teammates played in 1928.
They just put the new edition on it when I got there. It was a larger field. It was a thrill.
When Clarence Doc Spears stepped onto that field in 1932, the hope was his teams would help fill the stands around it.
Camp Randall was just a little horseshoe then.
But there was very little luck in the horseshoe during Spears' tenure. Instead, he ran into the strong will of legendary Wisconsin basketball coach Walter Doc Meanwell, who was now the athletic director at Wisconsin. The two Doc's egos had them battling over players.
Meanwhile, wanted me to play basketball. I went out for track and football. I went out for basketball and he took me along. On the train that we were taking, no flying at that time, he was telling the other players that I was wasting my time on the track team. And he also said, and he'll never make a name for himself. Well, we stopped at Chicago, and there was a special paper out. Daily News was a paper at that time. And the headline on the sport page is a Bear breaking the shot put record. The guys heard him telling me that, and they all went out, and each one bought a paper, and they all opened it up to the sporting page record, and they were reading it with my headline that I'd broken the shot put record. And Meanwhile was sore as hell.
In the meantime, the two doctors continued to be sore at each other as well. Spears was never able to produce another winner after his first year in '32. His last season in 1935, a dismal 1-7 campaign, included an opening day loss to South Dakota State.
Well, I remember South Dakota State when they beat Wisconsin. That was quite an embarrassment.
It was also the beginning of the end of Spears' coaching career at Wisconsin. At the end of the season, he also faced allegations of misconduct stemming from his continued feud with Meanwell. Eventually, both men were fired.
They both broke the rules, and they both got fired.
Even though the athletic program and attendance had been thrown for a loss, there were a couple of lasting traditions from Spears' tenure.
Well, varsity, yes, I sang varsity. Varsity, U-Rah-Rah, Wisconsin. I think it had just started about that.
Actually, varsity had been part of the university band and chorus repertoire since the turn of the century. Fans had been singing it at football games. What had just started in 1934 was the now familiar arm wave.
Ray made a lot of changes. Of course, he's the guy that introduced the whole arm swing thing to varsity.
New band director Raymond Dvorak had just arrived from the University of Illinois.
He introduced it and it caught on immediately. I think it's one of our great traditions.
With innovative marching, animated formations, and even singing, Dvorak's bands began to forge a reputation as one of the highlights on a Camp Randall Saturday. Dvorak and his band were there at the homecoming rally in 1934 when a long-lost Badger hero returned.
I was only 10 years old then. Pat O'Day came back. You know, he was missing for about 20, 25 years. Somebody discovered him as a business manager in a lumber camp in Northern California.
He became anonymous. He moved to San Francisco. He changed his name.
After his playing days, O'Day coached for a few years, including 2 at Notre Dame. Then many people thought he had died in World War I.
You know, he was a legendary kicker here, and they were skeptical about him being from Wisconsin, being this great kicker. When they discovered him out there, they wrote to Hank McCormick, the sports editor. He outlined about 20 questions to ask this guy. And this guy knew all these places on State Street where he used to hang around, and they determined this was the guy. And they brought him back for a pep rally down there. There was about 5,000 people down at the lower campus where they used to have the bonfires and homecoming. They had a miserable season that year, but they beat Illinois 7-3 or something.
O'Day's return may have helped salvage the '34 season for Spears, but he would only win one more game as the Badgers coach. Camp Randall was also experiencing a bit of a depression, growing only slightly as money became available from state lawmakers. With Spears gone, the new UW Athletic Board reached into the annals of football lore for a coach to increase wins, attendance, and revenue. They chose former Notre Dame quarterback Harry Stuhldreher.
He seemed like a pretty likable guy.
Stuhldreher was part of the Notre Dame backfield sports writer Grantland Rice had dubbed the Four Horsemen, comparing the players to the Four Horsemen of the apocalypse: famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. If Stuhldreher's alias was famine, it fit his record at Camp Randall in the late 30s. Fans remained hungry for wins, especially against Big Ten teams. But there was plenty of talent on the field.
They had some great players, but not an Eddie Jankowski, I think, was the first Packer recruit from Wisconsin. And he was a great fullback in the 30s. And then Howie Weiss was an All-American in 38, and they had a great team.
That team left Camp Randall for a cross-country train ride to play UCLA in Los Angeles. The Badgers were treated to a tour of Hollywood studios and met Clark Gable, who was filming Idiot's Delight. They were also on the set of The Wizard of Oz. The Badgers beat UCLA, but they found out there was no place like home to lose their shot at the Big Ten title. The very next week, Minnesota pounded them 21-0 in front of the Camp Randall crowd.
They didn't win a championship, but they had a shot at the championship and blew it. Minnesota was always good in those years.
The 1939 team ended a disappointing decade for the Badgers and Camp Randall faithful, with just one win. But Stuhldreher's coaching fortunes were about to change. The Badgers were about to hit him again harder and enjoy a whirlwind blowing in on Crazy Legs. By 1940, more students were arriving in Madison to attend the growing university. World War II in Europe had the U.S. gearing up for involvement, and the number of military personnel on campus was rising.
This campus was chronically short of dorms, and they thought experimentally if they just threw 200 dorm rooms on the back of the football stadium, that would be a good thing to do.
The Works Progress Administration did the work. By the 1940 season, they had added 7,500 seats on the east side, completed the dorms, and even reopened a local quarry for Madison sandstone to cover the outside walls. This was the Camp Randall Stadium with its 45,000 seats that was home to one of the most beloved teams in school history.
It wasn't until 42. 42, they had this great team with Hirsch and Harder and Hoskins and Dave Schreiner and Fred Nagus. And they were 8-1-1. Notre Dame tied them. That was the start of Wisconsin's getting into big-time football. Because Hirsch was a big-timer.
Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch was not only a big-timer, he was a favorite of the fans and his teammates.
To greet him and talk with him was always a fun. It was something that you enjoyed doing. He made it fun, his conversation with you. There's the Elroy's got the ball right there now.
John Roberts was Hirsch's teammate on that 42 team.
Well, that's the Notre Dame shift. Well, that's what they call a Notre Dame shift.
Watching game films from those glory days brings him back to a time when he was just a kid from Iowa trying to play Big Ten football on Camp Randall's field.
The years to follow, the field became more familiar to you. You became so in love with it, really. I still in awe as I go down there and sit at the games now and have a nice seat and imagine myself out there some 60 years ago.
Roberts didn't get out on the field right away.
And that freshmen were not eligible to see at that time, and so I spent the game days then selling apples in the stands for the W Club.
In 1940, Roberts finally got his chance to run out of the Camp Randall tunnel as part of the varsity.
There's an atmosphere now with Camp Randall and the Badgers that is hard to beat anywhere. This field was 35 or 40,000 people around behind you at that time. You feel everyone's looking at you at first, and then you forget about that. You go on and do your job.
By 42, his job as a guard was to block for the likes of Pat Harder, Mark Hoskins, and Hirsch.
You knew who was behind you when you were making those blocks.
If the tie against Notre Dame catapulted the Badgers into big-time football in 42, it was a game against the Great Lakes Naval Academy that created a legend. Hirsch tells the story in the UW's Oral History Project.
I got off a run of 40 or 50 yards against Great Lakes that year in 42. A sports writer in Chicago Daily News, he saw the wobbling of the legs and he said the guy's got crazy legs, and that's what stuck.
And the Badgers were better than the talent-rich Great Lakes team, beating them 13-7. 2 weeks later, they returned to Camp Randall for a homecoming game against Ohio State. Coach Stuhldreher had his troops primed.
We were really high for that game. Everybody played just a little bit nearer their capabilities, you know.
And I was a freshman at the university, and I can still remember walking across the back end of Camp Randall was all practice fields then, and the baseball diamond was back there. And I can remember walking through that. It was a beautiful October 31st. The sun was bright, and everything was just right for an upset.
Crazy Legs and the Badgers delivered for the capacity Camp Randall crowd.
They were supposed to be so good. We were beating them, and it was a kind of an accomplishment.
And Hirsch had that great 59 run to set up a touchdown, and Harder scored the touchdown, and then Hirsch threw a touchdown pass to Schreiner. Schreiner was a great All-American that year.
Coach Stuhldreher's offense was the Notre Dame box, the style he had learned under Rockne. Some of the players thought it was outdated and even convinced the coach to allow them to do less of the arm wave when the backfield shifted. But it fit the talents of Dave Schreiner and Crazy Legs.
You know, they ran a single wing, you know, and he'd get a direct pass from center, and he'd run, and everybody would follow him because he was such a threat around right in, and he'd stop and throw across the field to Schreiner. And he scored on that pass against Ohio State, and he scored against Minnesota like that.
Unfortunately, between the Ohio State game and Minnesota game, the Badgers were not able to score against Iowa at Iowa City.
I sure do remember. In the second quarter there, I recovered a fumble. Tried to get in the end zone, and after 3 tries, Pat didn't get in.
Once again, the Big Ten championship would not be brought home to Monroe Street. But the Los Angeles-based Helms Foundation did name the Badgers national champions, based largely on their win over #1 ranked Ohio State.
Even during the Rose Bowl years, I wonder if there was much as enthusiasm then as there was in '42, because there was this long drought, through the 30s, and it was the first time they beat Minnesota that year 20-6, and the first time they beat Minnesota since '32, Mickey McGuire's game.
The 1942 team had gained plenty of ground for the up-and-down coaching fortunes of Stuhldreher. But the war quickly stopped any hope of a repeat performance in '43.
50% of the team actually went off campus after January 15th of that year. We all knew we had to do something, and everybody did. You had some people that you had to say goodbye to, and you didn't know when you were going to see them again.
Some of those players never would return. Camp Randall said goodbye to courageous young men, as it had nearly a century before. War continued to have a hand in the history of Camp Randall. With many of the best players in the military, Stuhldreher's '43 team only managed 1 win. '44 was not much better. The Badgers won only 3 games, and tragedy struck. Quarterback Alan Schaefer died from injuries he suffered in a game with Iowa. Schaefer's parents honored their son's memory with a memorial scholarship fund that is still awarded today. Then, in June of 1945, war once again hit close to home. 2 of 1942's heroes died in a battle distant from the fields of Camp Randall.
Bauman and Schreiner got killed in Okinawa, and I was right at Okinawa where they got killed.
As a young soldier, Hank Reese had seats at the midfield of history.
I just happened to be down the front lines one day when I saw that one of those tanks rolling along.
Some reports say tackle Bob Bauman was trying to get to All-American end Dave Schreiner's pinned-down platoon. He wanted to warn him that those tanks were on the way.
Those guys were Marines, and they stuck together.
Bauman never made it to Schreiner. Enemy gunfire cut down the big tackle. 2 weeks later, Schreiner, the former Big Ten most valuable player and popular captain of the '42 team, also died in action.
I remember the word swept over the island like wildfire. Schreiner got killed, not Bauman because he wasn't well known, but it was all Schreiner.
Back in Madison, the news saddened fans. After the war, the university named the stadium dorms in honor of Schreiner and Bauman. As fate would have it, the young man who fought near the 2 former Badger heroes found himself on the 50 again.
I started the university in 1946, and I lived underneath the football stadium. And it was kind of nice on a football Saturday.
In fact, Reese has spent much of his life not only living in the shadows of Camp Randall,
this is my Uncle Van, and this is myself.
But working across the street at a restaurant his Uncle Van Reese owned with Norman Bass. It's a Madison fixture called Mickey's Dairy Bar.
To me, it never changes. I don't know. I feel like I'm not in a time warp. I'm stuck in the same year, That's the idea. People beg us not to change it at all because everything else in their world changes except Mickey's. It's a constant.
Reese remembers back to when he was still living in the dorms on the east side of the stadium.
Don Gehrman was my roommate. He was a miler. He was the best miler in the nation. He told me he was going to be the best miler within a year, and I didn't take him too serious. I used to sit with his girlfriend over there for several races. He used to run around the football field. That was a quarter of a mile around. And the last 100 yards, he'd take her handkerchief and pull it out and wave it at her, and then he'd sprint the last 100 yards and run it about 10-2, you know, and pass everybody up.
Another freshman with a field side view was Jim Lute. Before renovation crews began gutting what had become athletic offices, he paid a visit.
Well, this wall was all solid. There were restrooms right along here. Yeah, and then the hallway went all the way down. It was a continuous hallway from Bauman House, this is Bauman House, to Schreiner House.
Lute came to school on a baseball scholarship.
It was great for me because I was with all the athletes. Yep, these were the windows, and bunk beds on either side. Somehow the room looks larger. I wonder if it is. I'm beginning to think again, we had a desk there, and a desk there, and a desk there, and then double bunks on each side.
The influx of returning veterans also forced the university to set up temporary trailer-style housing on the grounds of Camp Randall.
We showed an aerial photograph of the temporary sites just to show what it looked like, and a lady jumped up, stopped the program, ran up and said, "I lived in that one. That was $25 a month. The bathroom was outside, the laundry was outside, and you had a hot plate, and it was the 2 greatest years of my life." Part of talking about the history of this place is making that kind of connection.
But in 1951, the university decided the residence halls at the stadium were not sufficient.
The students said, "This is a horrible idea. We hate living here. It's drafty, there's long hallways, we're far away from campus." And so they moved the students out and moved the athletic department in.
For the men who lived here 50 years ago, the view may be breathtaking today.
Oh my God, look at the scoreboard.
But nothing compared to their seats at midfield half a century ago.
I had all kinds of friends from Fort High come. They'd come in my room and then we'd just walk into the game.
And Wisconsin goes ahead 7-0.
Wake up and walk 20 feet and you'd be on the 40-yard line, you know, walk right through the door.
Coach Harry Stuhldreher was just about to walk out the door. After 1942's success, he was only able to give the Badgers one more winning season.
Watch him charge in and knock down.
Even getting a few pieces of the hard rocks wasn't going to save his job.
Covers for Wisconsin and races to the goal
and we all got talking and said, "Why don't we go down to Wisconsin, bail them out?"
Samuels goes back to pass. He's hit hard by Pat O'Donohue and he
Opposing
fumbles.
offenses were just about to find out how tough it was to move in the red zone.
Let's go out to Camp Randall Stadium, where on September...
You take Camp Randall,
Wisconsin opened up its schedule with its state...
there's so many memories. You could almost, you can hear the people. Way back when Harry Stuhldreher was here, and I was a freshman then. But then Ivan came in, Williamson. He brought Milt Brun in as an assistant. As you walk on the stadium, in the stadium, you can feel their presence.
Coach Ivy Williamson of Wisconsin scans the situation. There's a pass interception by Bob Radcliffe, who dashes all the way.
A lot of stories, you know, and a lot of great ball players. From Elroy Hirsch, Pat Harder, all the way up to Michi and Arlen Carl, and Jerry Witt.
The senior end, Pat O'Donohue.
Pat O'Donohue could very well have put himself on that list. With the renovation moving forward, O'Donohue looked back.
When I first came down here, of course, the upper deck wasn't there. And then the North Stadium came across, it was cut down. It wasn't finished.
O'Donohue's freshman year of 1948 was Coach Stuhldreher's last. Stuhldreher's send-off was this game with Minnesota. It was the first time the traditional border battle was played for the prize of Paul Bunyan's axe. The Badgers lost the game and the axe. But the two teams still take part in a spirited battle for the axe, no matter what their records. Ivan "Ivy" Williamson was the Badgers' next coach.
Ivan was quite quiet. He wasn't that loud.
Handed off to Alamici.
Williamson's mission was to rebuild the team. The stadium was undergoing a little rebuilding too.
Then the north end zone was filled up in the 1950s.
A $500,000 expansion replaced temporary seats for good and raised the stadium capacity to 50,000, just in time for the 1951 season. O'Donohue and his Badger teammates gave those 50,000 fans something to cheer about.
Ollie Strela, who runs wide to his left for the touchdown.
We just had a bunch of guys who loved to play football, and there was nobody better than us in our mind, and we came out every day to prove it.
This was the best team in history, a statement made by the incomparable Pat O'Day.
And when we come running down, we were always looking over our shoulder to see, we could tell by the rows and the sections how many people were in the stand. We were kind of a cocky bunch. We knew we were going to put on a good show, and we wanted people here to see us.
Don Leahy fades back to pass. There goes the ball out to the left. But Dornberg leaps high, intercepts the pass, and away he goes down the sidelines.
What they saw was impressive defense.
Well, the defense, to show you how good it was, the first 4 ball games of the year, the defense outscored the offense.
3-yard touchdown run, and Wisconsin.
We outscored them. We scored more points than they did.
He grabs one now off the arm of Jaffers.
That was the #1 defensive team in the country.
Before he is hauled out.
Their solid defense earned them a nickname of the Hard Rocks.
That came from Henry J. McCormick, the sports writer at the time, and he wrote a big article. We were about 3/4 of the way through the season, and he put the name on it.
First is hit by Gene Felker.
Tough guys.
He gets away only to be dropped for a 13-yard loss.
Dr. O'Donohue.
By Pat O'Donohue.
I mentioned to him when I was writing my book on football that 51 was one of the best teams in the Badgers' history. He says, best team? We were the best team. He said, one of the best. My ass. They were tough. He was an All-American that year.
Carl Speed puts him in the open.
It didn't take the offense long to catch up.
Goal line.
And they still call Wisconsin's Alan Amici the horse.
It had a future 3-time All-American named Alan the Horse Amici.
Alan was one of the nicest guys you ever want to meet. He was a football player that you dream of. As a coach, he could do everything. He had a great attitude, and he's just a great person.
The combination of the horse and the Hard Rocks was hard to beat.
Second down on the Hoosier 27.
In the Indiana game that year, they were also hard to see.
I was working at Stevens Point then, and I came down in this snowstorm.
Snow flurries early Saturday morning suddenly turned into a howling blizzard.
And I remember when it was blizzard, and I was telling my wife, now, when you get to Madison.
Twice the field was swept clean of snow.
In the city, it won't be this bad. We got down to Madison, it was worse down here than it was in the country.
5 inches of snow covering the field and a howling north wind.
I didn't get to the game till the middle of I think it was the second quarter. And by that time, Amici had been fumbling and they took him out. He was a freshman then.
It's Cota fading way back. There goes that long, long heave. Hutchison is...
But they finally won on Cota's pass to Billy Hutchinson. 6-0.
That's how Wisconsin downed Indiana.
You take Amici and Harlan Carl, Archie Roy Burks, Gary Witt. They were all great runners and big and fast.
On the dead run, he pitches a perfect strike down the field.
With John Cota, they never had a better quarterback.
3 yards up the field to the northwest.
Those were just some of the heroes fans watched at Camp Randall in '51. Some young fans on Madison's east side were lucky enough to have the players take a local road trip once in a while.
We were very fortunate. I lived over just east of the Hare River in Rutledge Street, and about 3 doors down, Gary Messner lived there.
Center Gary Messner.
And Gary was a center on the early 50s, and Amici was one of his teammates. So Gary was the guy we looked up to. He had gone to East High School.
Haluska with the ball.
He would occasionally have the guys over to the house that were out of town to have a dinner, and he would call up and say, you know, if you guys, kids wanted to come down, and you know, we were 10, 11 years old at the time, and meet some of the guys, well, Paul Schwako and Jim Haluska and Amici or Jim Hammond, they'd be there, you know, the college guys, and so you had a chance to meet them.
Future Badger star and athletic director Pat Richter also watched them on the field.
Amici gave the Hawkeyes a taste of broken field power when he
Sneaking under the fence over there in that corner was usually the place you could get in if you could. And if you ran fast enough, you'd get away from the ushers, but they more or less just was kind of a challenge. They'd run a little bit and then kind of let you go.
Richter and other fans were in for a decade of good football.
Amici takes the handoff first through the middle of the line, stampedes first 16 yards.
The 51 Hard Rocks lost their chance at the Big Ten title when they lost to Illinois.
More than 52,000 fans have packed Camp Randall Stadium to watch the Rose Bowl-minded Badgers against the Big Ten defending champions. Handoff goes to Harlan Carl, almost stopped there, stays on his feet.
But in 52, Amici and Harlan Carl led the Badgers to their first Rose Bowl.
His feet for a gain of 35 yards. Haluska, Amici, Carl and company are going to be hard to beat from here on out.
Where's your W? Oh, there. How are you? Hey, Jim. Win, go Badgers. It's good to be back.
Every year since the U.S. entered World War II, the men who have done battle at Camp Randall gather for National W Club Day.
Oh, a lot of good memories. Oh, yeah.
It's a chance to share memories and breathe in the tradition of a football Saturday. That tradition runs deep with Hal Rebholz.
My father was here back in 1927, 28, 29. He was honorable mention All-American as a fullback and as a linebacker. My uncle Russ Rebholz also was here 29, 30, 31, 32. So there's a tradition in our family that started back then. And just great to follow them and have a chance to play, and now to be out here and watch these young men carry that tradition.
Camp Randall was a smaller place when Rebholz practiced against the Hard Rocks in the Horse.
We had at that time about 50,000 people in the stadium because you didn't have the upper deck and you didn't have the new building that's going on over here. We still large turnout because during the Ivy Williamson years we had winning teams.
Drops that ball and Wisconsin recovered.
Williamson's teams racked up wins, and in 1952 he took the Badgers to their first Rose Bowl.
The Badgers take over first. Carl finds running room around left end.
Amici and Harlan Carl led the charge.
To another Badger touchdown.
The best breakaway runner I ever saw at Wisconsin was Harlan Carl.
We call the jittery jet, you know, he had such great moves and he's so quick for 40 yards. He'd run 60 yards and he'd tighten up. They'd catch him from behind, but for 60 yards he could run with anybody.
Though the Badgers did enjoy the Hollywood scene at that first Rose Bowl,
Jim Haluska pitches out to Alan Amici.
Carl and Amici were not enough to bring the Badgers to a win.
Burks with the ball is hit hard as he tries left end, fumbles, and it's recovered by Southern California.
Good to see you. Yeah.
The men who played on that team remember Williamson's philosophy remained the same, win or lose.
Ivy Williamson used to say at games like this to play our best, because 10 or 20 years from now we'll look back and we won't be able to say, oh, I wish I would have tried harder or done more. He said, do your best today. Now's your chance to do your best.
It seemed Amici took Williamson's words to heart. In 1953, he racked up another big season. In his 4 years at Camp Randall, Amici gained 3,345 yards, was named an All-American 3 times, and won college football's most prestigious award, the Heisman Trophy.
Alan Amici, one of the finest men as well as a great player that I had a chance to play with here in Wisconsin.
Last time I saw Alan, he was sitting right in one of those stools there. Then he turned pro, and I never saw him again in here.
Amici was gone, but Williamson's teams kept winning.
Ivy Williamson.
Ivy turned that football business around in 1 or 2 years.
Often a single play is run.
Went from punting on 3rd down under old Harry. He gave up. They just punted on 3rd down, and the crowd would boo, and then his punter would shake his fist at the crowd, you know.
Join the crowds bound for Camp Randall Stadium.
The capacity crowds of 51,000 under Williamson's leadership led the UW to consider new ways to add more seating.
The place was sold out. People were clamoring for tickets, and they couldn't figure out a way to make it bigger. So they lowered the field in the mid-1950s, about 1956, lowered it about 15 feet, added almost 20 rows of seats.
The new addition brought the stadium to a capacity of just over 63,000 seats in 1958. By then, Williamson had left his coaching position to take over as the athletic director. He hired Milt Brune, his line coach, to be his successor.
And Milt and I got along great, because he didn't like his players talking to the press.
One of those players was the boy from Madison's East Side who used to sneak into games at Camp Randall. Pat Richter had developed into an all-around athlete with particular skill at catching a football.
Dale Hackbart was a senior when I was a freshman. Freshmen weren't eligible, but we used to scrimmage against the varsity.
Richter watched as Hackbart led the Badgers to the 2nd Rose Bowl in team history in 1960. The Badgers lost.
Vanderkellen fakes once, then fires a beauty to his All-America end Pat Richter, and it's touchdown.
In his senior season of 1962, Richter was the team captain and was hauling in plenty of passes from quarterback Ron Vanderkellen.
Vanderkellen is making good use.
If anybody ever rated the Heisman Trophy, it was Vanderkellen. But he didn't get any of the preseason hype. Nobody knew about him.
The undefeated Wildcats of Northwestern, the #1 team in the country, move into Camp Randall.
But after top-ranked Northwestern came to town, the whole nation knew about him.
Vanderkellen finds Gary Kroner loose.
Vanderkellen threw 3 touchdowns, and the Badgers routed the Wildcats 37-6.
At the top of the Big Ten.
The Big Ten championship is on the line.
2 weeks later, it was the border battle with Minnesota.
Vanderkellen connects with All-American Pat Richter for an 18-yard
The title
gain.
was on the line for the Badgers.
Of course, the Minnesota game at the end of the '62 season was a very controversial game, a lot of penalties.
Interference is called against Wisconsin.
Highly charged, it was for the Axe.
Jim Nettles saves the game for Wisconsin by intercepting. Wisconsin holds its 14-9 margin to win the Big Ten title with its finest season since 1912.
And we won that game, and that got us into the Rose Bowl.
Wisconsin will represent the Big Ten in the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day.
The Badgers' 3rd Rose Bowl was the most exciting yet. Vanderkellen and Richter mounted a furious comeback, but Wisconsin ran out of time, losing 42-37. Milt Brune would only have one more winning season. But the success of the early 60s would mean more changes at Camp Randall and on campus.
The Wisconsin offense is again rolling.
In 1963, average attendance at Camp Randall hit 61,223, an all-time high up to that point.
Gary falls into the end zone for a touchdown, and the home folks go wild.
Following the season, the UW Board of Regents decided it was time for the stadium to grow up.
That was when the upper deck was built in 1965, 1966. One of the greatest bargains ever, about a $4 million project built by Findorf in 9 months. And so the next year they had 13,000 more seats.
Unfortunately, by 1966, the Badgers were winning less. Many of those 75,000 seats remained empty. The escalation of war in Vietnam had changed everything. young men were once again being called to war, and football at Wisconsin was being played under the cloud of campus protest.
To engage in some kind of political activity in this city.
There were so many riots down. You know, when I'd go up to, come from Sheldon Street, down Regent and up West Washington, and I'd look over toward the campuses and there'd be just a haze over there from all the tear gas. There were riots every day and every night over there.
Madison was at the forefront of the anti-war movement. Coach Milt Brune had a daily reminder of the tension on campus.
In fact, the National Guard was stationed at Camp Randall when he was coaching. Years later, we used to laugh because he used to have a pass to get into his office because it was so volatile down there. And it was tough recruiting. Parents around Wisconsin didn't want to send their kids to Wisconsin.
The action on the football field was less dramatic than on campus. But as with many good stories, there was a little foreshadowing at Camp Randall in '66. It happened in a Badger loss to Nebraska.
To this day, my friends still tease me about that day.
Barry Alvarez, a reserve linebacker for Nebraska, stepped in front of a Badger pass.
I was fortunate enough to have an interception and run it 25 yards and got so excited I got rigor mortis in my legs I couldn't bend my legs. We had a picket fence set up blocking for me, and I turned and ran right to the quarterback so he could tackle me because I was embarrassed. I couldn't run any further.
Camp Randall was already smiling on the future football coach. Fans had very little to smile about as the '60s came to a close. Former Hard Rocks quarterback Johnny Cota had been brought in to replace Milt Brune as head coach. Cota's teams and die-hard fans endured a 2-year stretch without a win.
I came to school here in '68 when the Badgers were in the throes of a 23-game winless streak. John Cota was the coach, and one of the most memorable games from that era was in 1969 against Iowa. The Badgers snapped that 23-game winless streak. The final score was 23-17. All 23 points were scored in the fourth quarter. And the hero of that day was number 23, Randy Marks.
That was a big, memorable day at Camp Randall. The fans just stormed the field afterwards. Carried Cota off on their shoulders.
This town absolutely rocked. You would have thought they had clinched a berth to the Rose Bowl.
The new band director that year was Mike Leckrone.
People would say the students rushed the field, and they did. They rushed the field, but it wasn't at all like it was in later years. They just didn't know what to do because they hadn't won ever before.
The new athletic director was, of course, Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch. He inherited a $250,000 department deficit.
My first year was also Elroy's first year. We kind of grew up into the job a little bit together, and we often confided in each other about what was going well and what wasn't.
Because at a time when nobody wanted to send their kid to this school, in the late '60s, this campus was up for grabs. During that turbulent period in Madison, Wisconsin, and on this campus was Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch. But he went from house to house, just about, from city to city, ranging from the south to the northern part of the state, and got people back interested in Wisconsin athletics, specifically Badger football.
A new era appeared to be underway. But with just 3 wins in 3 years, Cota was fired as coach. Fortunately, before he left, he had devised a plan to capture the Roadrunner and some fans.
I can remember sitting with John Cota, and he was recruiting Rufus Ferguson. This is after they put the upper deck on, and it would never came close to being filled, you know. And he says, "We got a guy coming here to fill this stadium."
The old artificial turf is pulled away from Camp Randall's field. In its place, the latest innovation, field turf. Over the years, the various manufactured grass fields have supported some of the best. Its first incarnation, Tartan Turf, installed in 1968, carried the likes of Anthony A-Train Thompson and a charismatic young running back from Florida named Rufus Ferguson.
Coach Van Dyke told me he was assigned to go during his recruiting visit to come to Madison. He was assigned to pick him up at the airport. And here this little guy, about 5'6" or 7", 195 pounds, gets off the plane and he's got a Palm Beach suit on, you know, and it's about 7 degrees at Truax. And Van Dyke runs up to him and says, "Rufus," he says, "how'd you know it was me?"
It wasn't long before everyone at Camp Randall knew the speedy little runner with the patented touchdown celebration, the Roadrunner Shuffle.
Rufus doing his shuffle is a pretty special thing.
Mark Cullen was a defensive back on those teams of the early 70s.
I remember my first tackling drill, I had to go against Rufus. And I just remember shutting my eyes and hoping I'd be able to come out of that.
Cullen came out fine. 30 years later, he heads the construction company renovating Camp Randall. But it was Ferguson who led coach John Jardine's Badgers out of the football doldrums of the late 60s.
We can beat any team on a given Saturday.
After Rufus, Badgers are fortunate enough to recruit a small tailback out of Chicago St. Rita named Billy Merrick.
Rufus was tremendous, and he was such a great guy. I mean, he lived to play this game and be in front of the people, and I probably was just the absolute opposite, where he would do his dance in the end zone, and I just would flip the ball. He was an entertainer. You know, he was fun to be around.
Badger fans found Merrick's style of football was pretty fun to be around, too.
I love the turf. For a little guy like me, who's more of a scat back, the turf is tremendous.
Against Minnesota, he gained 304 yards rushing, 43 carries, and scored 5 touchdowns. And that's, to me, one of the great games at Camp Randall.
Merrick and Ferguson benefited from some great line play, led by All-American center Mike Webster.
Probably the best football center that ever played the game in the NFL.
Today, Mike Pacini is like thousands of other fans enjoying the atmosphere of a Camp Randall Saturday. In 1972, he was Webster's backup on those teams that brought fans back to Camp Randall.
We went from 45, 50,000 to 72, 75,000. We were always close, we just never could quite get over the hump early on.
But in 1974, Jardine thought they did.
The moment that sticks in my mind the most is when Jeff Mack caught a beautiful pass right down here on the west sideline from Greg Bolig to basically put the knife in Nebraska's heart, and we beat them. I'll just never forget that. The town was up for grabs. It was pandemonium.
Fans were happy to have something to cheer about other than what was going on in the stands.
Camp Randall, with the fan base that we had, was just so tremendous when you come out. Anything you did at all, you could just hear the vibration around you. Of course, at Camp Randall, the strange thing is that half the fans were going crazy, and you'd look up and they're passing a body. It's got nothing to do with the game. So you had all of these things going on there that most of the time you thought it was about the game, but lots of times it wasn't.
The Portage plumber, Terry Westergaard, was one fan favorite.
He would travel the perimeter of the stadium, getting everybody cheered up. He was having a good time, and the pom-pom girls seemed to be tolerating him, so it was a lot of fun.
One of the biggest attractions during those years at Camp Randall continued to be the UW Band.
We're there to be an entertainment part of the package of football.
Following in the footsteps of the innovative Ray Dvorak, band director Mike Leckrone started a few new traditions at Camp Randall.
We call it the run-on. It's really just fast marching.
The University of Wisconsin.
That traditional thing where the tubas come out, followed by the drum. I wanted to more or less send a signal to the whole stadium. The day is about to begin. And so we came out on the run-on, we stopped, and then we went down the field playing On Wisconsin that people know.
The re-energized crowds turned out in record numbers in the 70s, but Jardine's teams had just one winning season in 8 years. He was let go after the 77 season. New coach Dave McLean had the team winning again.
Cohey, touchdown, Wisconsin!
During a come-from-behind win against Oregon,
Look at the crowd at Camp Randall Stadium on this Badger comeback.
band director Mike Leckrone had the band playing the Bud song over and over again to fire up the crowd.
It was at that moment that people started realizing that the upper deck was shaking when we played You Said It All.
That led athletic director Elroy Hirsch to ask Leckrone not to play the song until 5 minutes after games, giving people on the upper deck a chance to clear out if they wanted. The fifth quarter was born.
We had always done post-game performances with a little crowd participation, but that really gave it the momentum to make it what it was today.
But McLean's team really arrived in 1981 when #1 Michigan came to town. The Badgers beat the Wolverines 21-14.
Dave McLean felt that he finally turned this program around when the people here at Camp Randall Stadium stopped paying attention to the Portage Plumber because they were too engrossed in the outcome of a football game.
You know, it was electric. It was fun.
Ironically, amidst all the wins, it was a loss that may be one of the most memorable games of the McLean era. The Badgers were trailing Illinois when McLean called for the bounce pass.
And I remember the player that brought the play in said, Dave McLean said run. He said, Coach said to run that silly play. And we got into the huddle and it was, all right, guys, this is what we're going to do. And called the play.
Randy Wright, bounce pass to Al Toon. Toon, the pass to Jeff Null for a score.
And I remember Al Toon coming up to me and saying, I got the crap knocked out of me. I never want to be a quarterback.
The Badgers ended up losing that game, but in 8 seasons, McLean's teams won their way to 3 bowl games. Sadly, prior to the 1986 season, McLean died following a heart attack.
Football's a part of your life, but it's just a part of your life. And he really did a good job of making you believe that and live that.
In 1988, the university named its new athletic training facility in honor of McLean. By then, players like Wright and Toon had gone on to pro football. But the Camp Randall memories remained.
You can't say enough about the fans and the support, even during the down years. It's just a fabulous place to play.
Construction crews began the Camp Randall renovation project's Phase 1 in early spring of 2003.
Phase 1 has been primarily new construction. It has been the addition of the suites and the clubs, and the new south end zone in the office building down in the southeast corner. This is what we call club level seating.
The premium club seats were appropriately named the Camp Randall Suites, private suites with an 8th floor view on the 50. Below it, 2 more levels of club seats stretching from goal line to goal line.
This will be premium club over here. You're standing in a suite right now.
They're called the Buckingham and Varsity Clubs.
The suites and the club seats have revenue streams from them that will allow us to do the restrooms and expand the concessions.
Pat Richter and Barry Alvarez were there on an icy cold January day when iron workers prepared to put the last piece of framework in place.
Great job, guys. Never seen a group of guys work so hard. I come early in the morning, and they've got lights on and working, and how they work through the season is just absolutely phenomenal.
Everybody's worked hard to make this a success.
Okay, coming down easy.
It was only fitting that the 2 men who had put their mark on Camp Randall for more than a decade were there for the ceremonial topping out.
Very Alvarez.
They had started when its fortunes were pretty close to rock bottom.
I happened to come here at a time when it was about as low as it could go.
Matt LePay joined Mike Lucas in the broadcast booth in the middle of Don Morton's 3 years as the head football coach. Morton and his run-heavy veer offense had arrived with high hopes.
I'm in the toy department at the university.
But for Camp Randall fans, the toys seemed to be broken.
First game I ever saw here was in '88 when I first was hired. There were 36,000 people to watch the Badgers lose to Western Michigan. Following week, they lost to Northern Illinois. Following week, they lost. They were 1-10. It was.
Welcome to Wisconsin.
Thank you very much.
Great.
It's a pleasure to be here.
After the 1989 season, the sentence ended. New athletic director Pat Richter and Chancellor Donna Shalala hired Barry Alvarez to replace Morton.
When we came in for that first game and that first year, we weren't selling it out, yet I liked the atmosphere. I really felt that the people wanted good football and understood football, and football was important to them. And if we could put a good product on the field, I really felt as though we could have a definite advantage playing here.
Fletcher.
Within 3 years, the Camp Randall faithful saw a very good product.
We were a team that was full of a bunch of no-name guys at the time.
Terrell Fletcher was one half of a backfield tandem that fans quickly got to know. Fletcher and Brent Moss had rushed the Badgers to a 6-1 record by the time Michigan came to Camp Randall.
We really had confidence. And that was a turning point, is that we were able to bring down the mighty Michigan.
The huge 13-10 win was overshadowed by what happened after the game.
The crowd was into it, and it was a great win. Then obviously at the end of the game, there was the tragedy that happened.
Oh my God! We need paramedic.
The tragedy has become known as the Surge.
People started coming down on top of us. We were laying down with about 20, 30 people on us. I thought we were going to die.
University Police Assistant Chief Dale Burke was at the game as a spectator.
You couldn't really see what was happening down here.
He looked down into the student section as fans pushed toward the field.
I remember looking down here, and to me it looked like somebody had dropped a bomb in the student section. There were bodies everywhere. You got to remember, the students stand. They don't sit, okay? They're standing up here on this. If I lean forward now, I fall just like a domino against the person in front of me, who falls forward, hits the person in front of them. That's what happened. And if you watch it on the tape, you can kind of see it. It's almost like a wave of people.
About 6 PNBs.
Burke, dozens of other emergency personnel, and even players sprang into action to help the victims crushed under the wave.
I was one of the last guys off the field from the game, because it was crazy out there to get off the field. There was tears in the locker room, and guys were generally more concerned with what was going on with the people out there than that we just beat Michigan.
Fortunately, as when the stands collapsed at Old Camp Randall in 1915, nobody was killed.
Looking back on it, it's amazing to me that nobody died or was seriously injured.
The thing that really shows how Madison is and how Camp Randall is, they quickly fixed it up. The next week we played Ohio State in a night game, and it was packed and just as crazy as it was the week before. With everyone still remember what had happened that day.
Quarterback Darrell Bevel and the Badgers tied the Buckeyes and eventually earned Wisconsin's first Rose Bowl berth in 31 years. This time, the Badgers brought the Rose Bowl trophy home to Camp Randall, beating UCLA 21-16. On 2 counts, that first Rose Bowl championship team paved the way for improvements to Camp Randall. The surge forced a temporary fix to prevent future mishaps in the student section, but a permanent solution would be needed. And with the team winning again, more seats would be needed for more fans.
Wisconsin already had tradition from the football program. We just relayed a foundation.
Alvarez's teams kept building on that foundation and tradition. It helped that they had another runner with a nickname that rivaled the horse.
He was a 250, 260-pound guy who made moves that guys that big aren't supposed to be able to make.
The Great Dane was particularly good at moving the Badgers into the red zone with the help of linemen like Mark Tauscher and a revved-up crowd.
A late game against Penn State where they played the song Jump at the end in the fourth quarter. We knew we were going to go to the Rose Bowl if we won. The game wasn't quite in hand yet, but just the crowd and the atmosphere. I think everybody that was on the field that day can remember how loud it got. I've never been there when it was louder.
The Camp Randall crowd had plenty to cheer about.
It's a thrill to go to the Rose Bowl.
The Badgers were on the way to their second Rose Bowl win under Alvarez. In 1999, Dane gave them even more to cheer about in the last game of the season.
I'm estimating at least 500,000 people will say that they were here to watch Wisconsin play Iowa. You could feel the buzz walking into the stadium 90 minutes before the kickoff.
Throughout the game, we was getting closer to the record. I had a nice run before I broke the record. My fullback, Chad Coons, was like, "Don't break the record without me."
You were hoping it would be a vintage Ron Dane run, a little shake, a little power.
Coach called a play like a power play where Chad was in, and Chad came through and got the linebacker, and I had to do the other linebacker.
Open up the history books. Here comes Ron Dane.
It was a vintage Dane run. He bowled over Chris Chambers on the way
to
breaking the record.
It was just a great moment. I didn't know if I wanted to run around the field and wave to all the fans or just stand there. I didn't want to cry because I knew all the guys would get on me. But it was hard, especially after the game, like seeing the 33 come up.
Dane set college football's rushing record of 6,397 yards with the run. It was his final game on the field at Camp Randall.
Every game we had, it was about 70,000 people, or more. There was still people that couldn't get in, that's outside. That's partying, having a good time.
The university decided it was again time to make room for more of those people inside.
It was the time to make a move. The stadium needed the renovation. Our fans really needed a modern stadium. They needed the luxury of being able to go to a restroom in a reasonable amount of time. We needed to upgrade our facilities just to keep up with the other teams that we're competing with.
Alvarez's teams remained competitive as officials began to develop plans.
This is the first time ever that the whole stadium has been looked at all at once.
You may remember when we talked about this model a little.
After a temporary delay of the $104 million project in early 2002, UW alums Ted and Jack Kellner donated $10 million to get the project underway again.
It's not so much an expansion as a renovation, just because you've got a stadium that's 70 plus years old, and we all know that most of the restrooms those are the originals.
Increasing the number of toilets, more than doubling them for women, was just one of the improvements. Crews worked throughout the 2003 and 2004 seasons, adding suites, athletic offices in Kellner Hall, plus widened concourses and entrances to increase safety and convenience for fans. One of the most visible changes? State-of-the-art video replay scoreboards. The renovation transformed this historic gem into a modern marvel. But throughout the project, an eye was kept on honoring the past.
When you come here, yes, there's something new and grand, but yet it feels like it's always been here. If you had built the stadium this way 100 years ago, it would look this way today.
It isn't jarringly new. It feels like it ought to be here. It's true to the people who have been here 10 years ago, 30 years ago, or 50 years ago. And we have fans and alumni who are from all those different generations. And they all have things they see that were part of their history, and they're still here.
And they'll stay here for future generations in the red zone we know as Camp Randall.